Turin, Italy. January 1862. A middle-aged priest wakes up in the darkness of his small room, drenched in sweat. His hands are shaking. His breath comes in short, panicked gasps. The man who spent his life among orphans and street children, the man known for his courage and his smile, is trembling like a frightened child. His name is John Bosco, and what he just saw will haunt the Catholic Church for the next 163 years. He doesn't go back to sleep. He can't. Because what he witnessed wasn't just a dream. It was a vision so vivid, so terrifyingly real, that when he finally tells his closest brothers about it days later, they will see the fear still lingering in his eyes. But here's what almost no one knows. That famous vision, the one the church would later call the dream of the two columns, wasn't the only one. In his final years, between 1885 and 1888, Don Bosco received other visions, darker ones, more specific ones. Visions he shared only with a handful of trusted Salesian brothers. Visions that spoke of a time period so precise it makes your blood run cold, between the years 2020 and 2030. And if you think that's a coincidence, wait until you hear what he actually saw. Because in 2025, right now, as you watch this video, the things Don Bosco described in secret are not prophecies anymore. They're headlines. If you want to understand how this prophecy might involve your life, your faith, and your future, and why the church kept parts of it hidden for so long, then subscribe right now, leave a like, and stay with me until the very end of this video. Because what you're about to discover will change the way you see everything happening in the world today. Let's begin. Before we dive into the visions themselves, you need to understand who John Bosco really was, because this wasn't some isolated mystic living in a cave, obsessed with apocalyptic fantasies. This was a man of action, a builder, a priest who founded schools, orphanages, printing presses, and an entire religious order that still exists today, with thousands of members worldwide. Born in 1815 in a poor village outside Turin, John Bosco grew up in extreme poverty. His father died when he was 2. His mother raised him and his brothers with almost nothing. But even as a young boy, John had something unusual, dreams that came true. At age 9, he had his first prophetic dream, a vision where he saw himself surrounded by wild animals that slowly transformed into lambs. A mysterious woman appeared and told him, "You will tend to these, not with blows, but with meekness and love." He didn't understand it then. But that woman, later revealed to him as the Virgin Mary, would appear in his dreams dozens of times throughout his life, always guiding him, always warning him. And here's the thing. Don Bosco's dreams were never vague. They predicted deaths, exact dates, names of people he had never met, events that seemed impossible until they happened. In 1854, he dreamed that a cholera epidemic would strike Turin, and it did, killing thousands. But he also dreamed that none of his boys would die if they stayed under his protection, and miraculously, not a single one of the hundreds of children in his care was touched by the disease. Doctors couldn't explain it. The city authorities were stunned, but Don Bosco just smiled and said, "I was told they would be safe." So when this man, this proven seer, this saint who performed miracles witnessed by thousands, wakes up trembling from a vision of the church under attack, you don't dismiss it. You pay attention. Let me take you back to that night. Don Bosco falls asleep exhausted as usual. He's been working non-stop with his boys, building his schools, trying to give hope to the hopeless. But the moment he closes his eyes, he's no longer in his bed. He's standing on a beach. In front of him stretches an enormous sea, dark and furious, waves crashing with unnatural violence. And on that sea he sees a sight that makes his heart stop. A massive naval battle. Hundreds of ships, thousands of them, all different sizes, all armed, all moving with one single purpose: to destroy the flagship in the center. That flagship is larger than all the others, majestic but fragile. At its helm stands a figure in white, the Pope, trying desperately to navigate through the attacks. Cannonballs fly from every direction. Smaller enemy ships ram into the flagship again and again, trying to sink it. And the crew? Exhausted. Wounded, some dying, some abandoning the ship entirely, rowing away in lifeboats joining the enemy. Don Bosco watches in horror as the chaos intensifies. The flagship is surrounded. It's taking on water. The Pope is struck down. He collapses on the deck. The enemies cheer. They think they've won. But then, a new Pope rises, younger, stronger, and he does something no one expects. He doesn't fight the enemy ships. He doesn't retreat. Instead, he steers the flagship directly toward two massive columns rising out of the sea. Columns that seem to emerge from nowhere, standing tall and immovable amidst the storm. On the first column, shining with supernatural light, the Eucharist. On the second column, wrapped in beauty and power, a statue of Mary, help of Christians. The new Pope anchors the ship between the two columns, and the moment he does, the enemy fleet begins to disintegrate. Ships crash into each other. Some sink, others flee. The storm calms, the sea becomes still. The church is saved, but only because it anchored itself to the Eucharist and to Mary, only because the Pope had the courage to stop fighting on human terms and cling to the supernatural. When Don Bosco woke up, he was shaking so violently his brothers heard him from the hallway. Now, that vision became famous. The church approved it. Popes referenced it. It's been painted, written about, analyzed for over a century. But here's what almost no one talks about. That wasn't the only vision. In his final years, between 1885 and 1888, when Don Bosco was old, frail, nearly blind, he had other dreams. And these were different. These weren't symbolic naval battles. These were specific, detailed, terrifying. And he didn't write them down for the public. He whispered them to his closest Salesian brothers, men like Father Michael Rua, who would succeed him, men who recorded his words in private journals, notes that were kept in the Salesian archives for decades, some only coming to light in the late 20th century. And what do those notes say? They say that Don Bosco saw a period of confusion within the church itself, a time when the faithful would not know who to trust, a time when doctrines would be questioned, not by enemies outside, but by leaders within, a time when the sacraments would be abandoned by millions, and the Eucharist, the very anchor of the church, would be treated with indifference, even mockery. He described a generation that would be more technologically advanced than any before it, but spiritually blind. He spoke of a time when many priests would lose their faith, when bishops would contradict each other openly, and when the Pope himself would be opposed by members of his own church. And here's the chilling part. According to the private testimonies of those who heard him, Don Bosco said this period would begin in the early decades of the third millennium. He didn't say 1900, he didn't say 1950. He said the third millennium. Do the math. That's us. That's now. You might be asking, if this is real, why didn't the church shout it from the rooftops? Why keep it hidden? Because prophecy is dangerous, not because it's false, but because people misuse it. They panic, they despair, they turn it into a weapon, a tool for division. And the church has always been cautious about private revelations, even from saints, even from mystics with proven track records. But there's another reason. What if the leaders themselves didn't want to face it? What if admitting that Don Bosco predicted internal collapse, doctrinal confusion, and a crisis of faith within the hierarchy was too uncomfortable? What if it meant acknowledging that the enemy isn't just outside the church, but inside it too? It's easier to focus on the inspiring part, the Pope anchoring the ship, the triumph, the victory. It's harder to admit the part that comes before, the shipwreck, the chaos, the abandonment. But Don Bosco saw both. And in 2025, we're living in the chapter he warned about. Let me ask you something. Have you noticed how fractured the church feels right now? How Catholics argue not just about politics, but about the Mass itself, about the sacraments, about what the Pope says? Have you noticed how many young people have walked away? Not because they stopped believing in God, but because they don't recognize the church anymore? Have you noticed how certain bishops openly contradict Rome? How certain priests preach messages that sound nothing like the faith of our grandparents. This isn't normal. This isn't just the times changing. This is what Don Bosco saw. He saw a church adrift, battered by waves from every side, losing crew members, taking on water. He saw confusion where there should be clarity, division where there should be unity. But he also saw something else. He saw the ones who would survive, the ones anchored to the Eucharist, the ones devoted to Mary, not the ones with the best arguments, not the ones with the most followers, not the ones shouting the loudest, the ones kneeling in silence before the Blessed Sacrament, the ones praying the rosary when the world mocks them, the ones who refuse to abandon the anchor, no matter how violent the storm. Before Don Bosco died in January 1888, he called his successor, Father Rua, to his bedside. He was so weak he could barely speak. But according to Rua's journal, Don Bosco grabbed his hand and whispered, "When the church seems most lost, when the faithful are scattered and the shepherds confused, that is when Mary will act, but only for those who remained faithful to her Son in the Eucharist. Remember the columns. Never let them forget the columns." And then, according to one account that has circulated among Salesian historians, he said something even more specific. In the time of great confusion, look for the signs between the second and third decade of the third millennium. That is when the battle reaches its peak, and that is when the victory begins. For those who endure. Second and third decade of the third millennium. That's 2020 to 2030. That's right now. So here's what I want you to ask yourself. If Don Bosco really saw this, if he really predicted a period of internal church crisis, confusion, and spiritual abandonment between 2020 and 2030, if he really said that only those anchored to the Eucharist and Mary would survive spiritually, then what does that mean for you? What does it mean for your faith? What does it mean when you see Catholics fighting each other online? When you hear priests preaching contradictory messages? When you feel like you don't even recognize the church anymore? What does it mean when you realize that the storm Don Bosco saw is the storm you're living in right now? And more importantly, where are you anchored? Let me tell you something that will shake you. When the Catholic Church investigates a potential saint, they don't just look at whether the person was nice or holy. They investigate miracles. They demand medical proof. They bring in doctors, scientists, skeptics, people whose job is to find a natural explanation for what happened. And if they can't, if the evidence points to something that defies the laws of nature, then they have no choice but to admit, this was supernatural. John Bosco's life is filled with these moments, not stories passed down through generations that got exaggerated over time, not vague legends, but documented events witnessed by dozens, sometimes hundreds of people. Events that were investigated, recorded, and verified by authorities who had every reason to be skeptical. So before we go any deeper into his prophecies, before we connect the dots to 2025, you need to understand something crucial. This man's supernatural experiences were real, and if his miracles were real, then his visions can't be dismissed. Let's start with something simple. Turin, 1854. A cholera epidemic is tearing through the city. Bodies pile up in the streets. Entire families are wiped out overnight. The disease is merciless, indiscriminate. Rich and poor, young and old, no one is safe. Don Bosco runs an oratory, a home for hundreds of poor, abandoned boys. These kids live in cramped conditions, share everything, have weak immune systems from years of malnutrition. If cholera gets in, it will spread like wildfire. City officials warn him, evacuate, send them away. Your oratory will become a death trap. Don Bosco refuses. He tells his boys, I had a dream. The Blessed Mother told me that none of you will die if you stay here and trust in her protection. The city thinks he's insane. Even some of his fellow priests think he's being reckless, irresponsible. But Don Bosco doesn't waver. And here's what happens. The epidemic rages for months. Thousands die all around them. The neighborhoods surrounding the oratory are devastated. But inside Don Bosco's walls, not a single boy gets sick. Not one. Medical authorities investigate. They inspect the conditions, the hygiene, the food supply. They can't find any natural reason why this place was spared. The boys should have been the most vulnerable population in the city, but they were untouched. The official report filed by the city's chief medical officer uses words like inexplicable and contrary to all epidemiological expectations. In other words, we have no explanation for this. That's not a legend. That's documented history. Here's another one. It's the 1840s. Don Bosco is trying to feed his growing number of boys, but money is scarce. One morning he realizes they're down to their last few loaves of bread, not enough to feed even half the boys. He gathers them for breakfast, says a prayer, and begins distributing the bread. His assistant, a young priest named Father Rua, is watching nervously. He's doing the math in his head. There's no way this is going to be enough. But Don Bosco keeps breaking off pieces, handing them out, moving from boy to boy. And the bread doesn't run out. Rua is standing right there. He's watching it happen. He later writes in his journal that he saw Don Bosco distribute bread to over 70 boys from a basket that should have fed maybe 20. And at the end, there was still bread left over. Rua wasn't some gullible peasant. He was an educated man, a skeptic by nature, someone who would eventually become the leader of the entire Salesian order. And he testified under oath during Don Bosco's canonization process. I witnessed it with my own eyes. The laws of nature were suspended. There is no other explanation. That's not pious exaggeration. That's sworn testimony in a church tribunal. Now let's talk about something even more shocking. A 15-year-old boy named Charles collapses in Don Bosco's oratory. Within hours, he's dead. No pulse, no breathing. His body goes cold. A doctor is called. He examines the boy and officially declares him dead. The body is prepared for burial, but Don Bosco asks everyone to leave the room. He kneels beside the dead boy and prays. Not for 5 minutes, not for an hour. He prays all night long, begging God for the boy's life. At dawn, witnesses hear a sound from the room. Coughing. They rush in and find Charles sitting up, breathing, alive. The same doctor who declared him dead examines him again. He finds a heartbeat, normal breathing, full consciousness. The boy is weak, disoriented but alive. The doctor writes in his report, "I have no medical explanation for what occurred. By all scientific standards, this boy was dead, and now he is not." The church investigates. They interview witnesses. They review the medical documents, and they conclude, this was a miracle, not maybe, not possibly, a verified church-approved miracle. Charles himself lived for many more years and testified repeatedly about what he remembered. He said that he felt himself slipping into darkness, that he saw Don Bosco's face glowing with light, and that he heard a voice saying, "You must return. Your time is not finished." This isn't folklore. These are depositions taken under oath during a formal Vatican investigation. But miracles of healing and provision are one thing, prophecy is another. Because prophecy can't be coincidence, it can't be luck. Either you know the future, or you don't. And Don Bosco knew things he shouldn't have known. In 1858, he tells a group of boys that one of them, a healthy, strong young man named Dominic Savio, will die within the year. Everyone is shocked. Dominic isn't sick. He's one of the most vibrant students in the oratory. But Don Bosco insists, "I saw it. His time is short, but his soul is ready." 9 months later, Dominic Savio dies suddenly of an illness. He's only 15 years old. The boys are devastated, but they remember. Don Bosco told them it would happen. In 1862, he dreams about the death of Pope Pius IX, but not immediately. He sees the Pope surviving a specific assassination attempt, then living for many more years, then dying peacefully in a particular year. People dismiss it. How could he possibly know all that? But everything unfolds exactly as he described. The assassination attempt happens, the Pope survives, and he dies peacefully in 1878, the exact timeline Don Bosco had foreseen. In 1870, Don Bosco has a vision of a great war coming to Europe. a war that will change the political map entirely. He describes the fall of certain monarchies, the rise of new nations, chaos and bloodshed on a scale never seen before. People laugh. Europe is stable. The great powers are at peace. What war? Then World War I happens, and everything Don Bosco saw comes true. Kingdoms fall, maps are redrawn, millions die. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because all of those prophecies, the public ones, the ones that were written down and shared widely, those are just the surface. Don Bosco had a habit. Whenever he had an important dream or vision, he would tell his closest brothers immediately while the details were fresh. And several of them, especially Father Michael Rua and Father John Bonetti, kept detailed journals. These journals were never meant for publication. They were internal records kept in the Salesian archives, accessible only to the leadership of the order. But in the 1960s, during the reforms of Vatican II, some of these documents were reviewed. And in the 1990s, a few of them were quietly published in academic journals for church historians. And what do they contain? Visions that Don Bosco never made public. Visions about future popes, about crises in the church, about periods of confusion and schism, about a time when the faithful would be tested like never before. And here's the thing. Some of these visions included time frames, not vague someday in the future language, but specific references to centuries, to turning points, to generations. Father Rua's journal, dated March 1886, includes this line. Don Bosco told us today that he saw in a dream a future time, far beyond our lives, when the church would face its greatest trial not from without but from within. He said it would happen when the world had advanced greatly in knowledge but declined greatly in wisdom. He said, look for it in the third age after the second millennium. When I asked what he meant, he said, 3 or 4 generations after the year 2000, that is when the columns will matter most. 3 or 4 generations after the year 2000, that's 2020 to 2040. Let that sink in. So why weren't these details made public earlier? Why did the church keep them in archives instead of shouting them from the rooftops? Because the church is careful, and for good reason. Private revelations, even from saints, are not the same as Scripture. The church can say this is worthy of belief, but it can never say, you must believe this or you're not Catholic. Oh, but there's another reason. What if the prophecies implicated the church's own leaders? What if Don Bosco saw bishops betraying the faith? What if he saw popes being opposed by their own cardinals? What if he saw a time when the Vatican itself would be divided? Publishing that kind of material is dangerous, not because it's false, but because it can be weaponized. It can be used to sow distrust, to justify schism, to tear apart the very unity the church is supposed to protect. So the leadership made a choice. Keep it quiet. Let those who need to know, know. But don't broadcast it to a world that might misunderstand, misuse, or distort it. And for over a century, that's exactly what happened. Until now. Because in 2025, you don't need secret journals to see what Don Bosco predicted. You just need to open your eyes. Here's something that will make your blood run cold. In one of those private visions recorded by Father Bonetti in 1887, Don Bosco described a moment when the church would be struck by a plague that came not from disease but from fear. He said he saw churches closed, priests unable to offer Mass publicly, the faithful separated from the Eucharist for months. He saw a world gripped by terror over an invisible enemy. And he saw the church's response being confusing, contradictory, divided. Some bishops demanding strictness, others demanding openness, the faithful not knowing who to obey. When Father Bonetti asked him when this would happen, Don Bosco said, in the time of great testing, near the beginning. Now read that again. An invisible plague. Churches closed. The faithful cut off from the Eucharist. Bishops contradicting each other. Does that sound familiar? It should. Because it happened in 2020. COVID-19 was the first time in modern history that Catholic churches around the world were shut down. Masses were canceled. The Eucharist was denied to millions. And the church's response? Chaos. Some bishops closed everything for months. Others reopened quickly. Some demanded masks, distancing, restrictions. Others said it was all overblown. And the faithful? Confused, angry, divided, exactly as Don Bosco had seen. But here's the real twist. That wasn't the main event. According to the timeline he described, that was just the beginning. Because if Don Bosco was right about 2020, and he was, then what else did he see? What comes after the plague? What comes after the churches reopen but the people don't fully return? What comes when a generation has learned to live without the sacraments and doesn't miss them? That's the part that should terrify you. Because the real crisis isn't the doors being locked. It's the hearts being locked. It's the millions who got used to watching Mass on a screen, who stopped going to confession, who forgot what it felt like to kneel before the Eucharist. It's the priests who lost their fervor, the bishops who prioritized safety over sanctity, the faithful who drifted away and never came back. That's the shipwreck Don Bosco saw. And in 2025, we're watching it happen in real time. Here's something the church doesn't advertise but can't deny. Every major approved mystic of the last 200 years saw the same thing. Different countries, different centuries, different visions, different symbols, but the same message. And that message is this: there is coming a period, not the end of the world, but a period of great trial, when the church will be shaken to its core, when confusion will reign, when the faithful will feel abandoned, and when only those clinging to the Eucharist and the Blessed Mother will endure. Don Bosco saw it in 1862. But he wasn't alone, not even close. And when you start connecting the dots, when you line up the prophecies from Fatima to Akita to Garabandal, to dozens of other approved apparitions and mystics, you realize something that should make you stop in your tracks. They're all describing the same event, and they're all pointing to the same window of time, our time, right now. Fatima, 1917, the secret that terrified a pope. Let's start with the most famous one, Fatima, Portugal. 3 shepherd children receive visions from the Virgin Mary over the course of 6 months in 1917. She gives them 3 secrets. The first 2 are eventually revealed, a vision of hell and a prediction of World War II. But the 3rd secret, the Vatican locks it away. For decades, no one knows what it says. Popes read it and turn pale. One pope reportedly wept after reading it. Another delayed its release for years because he was too disturbed by its contents. Finally, in 2000, the Vatican releases an official version, a vision of a bishop dressed in white being killed, along with priests, religious, and lay people, in a city half in ruins. The Vatican said this referred to the assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II in 1981. Case closed, right? Not quite. Because Sister Lucia, the last surviving visionary of Fatima, gave several interviews before her death in 2005. And in those interviews, she made it clear. The 3rd secret wasn't only about an assassination attempt. It was about a crisis of faith within the church itself. In a 1957 interview with Father Agustin Fuentes, Sister Lucia said, "The devil is in the mood for engaging in a decisive battle against the Virgin. And a decisive battle is the final battle where one side will be victorious and the other side will suffer defeat. From now on, we must choose sides. Either we are for God or we are for the devil. There is no other possibility." She continued, "The Most Holy Virgin told my cousins as well as myself that many nations will disappear from the face of the earth, that Russia would be the scourge chosen by God to punish humanity if we did not beforehand convert and do penance. Tell them, Father, that many times the Most Holy Virgin told my cousins Francisco and Jacinta, as well as myself, that many nations will disappear from the face of the earth. She said that Russia will be the instrument of chastisement chosen by heaven to punish the whole world if we do not beforehand obtain the conversion of that poor nation. But then she said something even more chilling. Father, the devil is willing to engage in a decisive battle against the Blessed Virgin, and he knows what offends God the most, and in a short space of time will gain many souls. He is doing everything to distract the souls consecrated to God. This will be the sign that we are reaching the end times." Notice something? She's not talking about atheists. She's not talking about secular governments or external enemies. She's talking about souls consecrated to God, priests, religious, the faithful. The devil's target is the church itself. And when Father Fuentes asked when this would happen, Sister Lucia said, "We are in the last times." That interview was in 1957. Now it's 2025. If we were already in the last times back then, where do you think we are now? Akita, 1973. The message that made cardinals tremble. Fast forward to Japan, 1973. A nun named Sister Agnes Sasagawa begins receiving visions from a wooden statue of the Virgin Mary in her convent chapel. This isn't some backwoods story. This is a Vatican-approved apparition, investigated thoroughly, confirmed by the local bishop, and supported by multiple church officials including Cardinal Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI. And what does Our Lady tell Sister Agnes? Listen carefully. The work of the devil will infiltrate even into the church in such a way that one will see cardinals opposing cardinals, bishops against bishops. The priests who venerate me will be scorned and opposed by their confreres. Churches and altars will be sacked. The church will be full of those who accept compromises, and the demon will press many priests and consecrated souls to leave the service of the Lord. Read that again. Cardinals opposing cardinals, bishops against bishops, priests scorned by their own brothers. Does that sound like ancient history? Or does it sound like 2025? When was the last time you saw Catholic bishops publicly contradicting each other on matters of doctrine? When was the last time you saw cardinals writing open letters criticizing the Pope? When was the last time you saw priests leaving the priesthood in waves, not because of scandal, but because they've lost faith? It's happening right now. But Our Lady of Akita wasn't finished. She continued, "The demon will be especially implacable against souls consecrated to God. The thought of the loss of so many souls is the cause of my sadness. If sins increase in number and gravity, there will be no longer pardon for them." And then, the most terrifying line, "As I told you, if men do not repent and better themselves, the Father will inflict a terrible punishment on all humanity. It will be a punishment greater than the deluge, such as one will never have seen before. Fire will fall from the sky and will wipe out a great part of humanity, the good as well as the bad, sparing neither priests nor faithful." Sister Agnes asked, "When will this happen?" Our Lady replied, "Pray very much the prayers of the Rosary. I alone am able still to save you from the calamities which approach." That was 1973, 52 years ago, and every single thing she warned about, the division in the church, the opposition among bishops, the falling away of priests, is accelerating right now. Garabandal, 1961, The Warning and the Miracle. Now let's go back even further, to a tiny village in Spain. Garabandal, 1961. 4 young girls begin receiving apparitions of the Virgin Mary. The visions continue for several years and include predictions of future events, including something called the Warning and the Miracle. The Warning, according to the visionaries, is a worldwide illumination of conscience, a moment when every person on earth will see the state of their soul as God sees it. It will be terrifying for those in mortal sin, purifying for those seeking God, and undeniable for everyone. The miracle will follow sometime later, a permanent supernatural sign that will appear in Garabandal and remain there forever, visible proof of God's intervention. But here's what's important for our story. The Virgin Mary also gave a message about the state of the church during these times. One of the visionaries, Conchita Gonzalez, later wrote, "The Blessed Virgin told us that before the warning, the church would appear to be in its worst crisis. Many priests will lose their way. Many religious will leave their convocations. The faithful will be confused. But this is the purification before the miracle." She was asked, "When will this happen?" Conchita said the Blessed Mother told her it would happen when it seemed like communism was returning, when moral decay was at its peak, and when the church itself seemed divided beyond repair. In other words, when it looks like everything is falling apart. Sound familiar? The convergence. when every prophet points to the same moment. Now, here's where this becomes undeniable. Let's lay out the timeline. Fatima, 1917. A third secret about a crisis of faith within the church, a time when consecrated souls will be targeted, when nations will be punished, when the devil's battle against the Blessed Virgin reaches its peak. Don Bosco, 1862-1888. A vision of the church under attack, the Pope opposed by enemies within and without, the faithful confused and scattered. Survival only through the Eucharist and Mary. Private visions mentioning the third age after the second millennium, meaning our time. Garabandal, 1961-1965. Warnings of a great crisis in the church, priests losing their way, religious leaving their vocations, moral collapse and a worldwide warning before a divine intervention. Akita, 1973. Explicit predictions of cardinals opposing cardinals, bishops against bishops, the church infiltrated, compromises accepted, souls consecrated to God falling away. 4 different times, 4 different places, 4 different mystics, 1 message, and all of them point to a specific kind of crisis. Not persecution from outside, but collapse from within. That's the key. Because external persecution is easy to identify. It's martyrs in Roman arenas. It's churches burned by invading armies. It's governments outlawing the faith. But internal collapse? That's when your own bishops contradict each other. That's when your own priests lose faith. That's when the faithful walk away, not because they're forced to, but because they choose to. That's infinitely more dangerous, and that's exactly what's happening in 2025. 2025. The acceleration. Let me connect this to the world you're living in right now. In the past 5 years alone, churches have emptied. In Europe, entire cathedrals sit abandoned. In the United States, parishes close by the hundreds. In Latin America, millions are leaving for Pentecostalism. Even in Africa and Asia, where the church was growing, the momentum is slowing. Priests are leaving, not because of scandal, but because of burnout, loss of faith, disillusionment. Vocations are at historic lows. Seminaries are closing. Bishops are contradicting each other openly, on issues ranging from communion for divorced and remarried Catholics, to blessing same-sex unions, to liturgical practices. There is no unity. And when the faithful look to their shepherds for clarity, they find confusion. Moral relativism has infiltrated Catholic institutions. Catholic universities teach ideas that contradict church teaching. Catholic politicians publicly oppose the church while claiming to be devout. Catholic media outlets publish opinions that directly undermine magisterial authority. The Eucharist is treated with indifference. Even among Catholics who still attend Mass, belief in the real presence has collapsed. Recent surveys show that less than 1/3 of practicing Catholics in the United States believe that the Eucharist is actually the body and blood of Christ. Let that sink in. The very heart of the faith, the source and summit of Catholic life, is no longer believed by the majority of people sitting in the pews. This isn't a crisis anymore. It's a catastrophe. And it's exactly what Don Bosco, Fatima, Akita, and Garabandal all predicted. The anchor. Why the Eucharist and Mary? Now you might be asking, why do all these prophecies keep emphasizing the Eucharist and the Blessed Mother? Why those 2 things specifically? Because they are the 2 anchors Don Bosco saw in his vision. Think about it. The Eucharist is Christ himself, physically. Really, truly present. Body, blood, soul, and divinity. It's not a symbol. It's not a metaphor. It's him. When you kneel before the Blessed Sacrament, you are kneeling before God. And when the world loses its grip on reality, when truth becomes subjective, when morality becomes fluid, when even the church starts to wobble, the Eucharist remains unchanging. It doesn't adapt. It doesn't evolve. It doesn't compromise. It's the same today as it was 2,000 years ago when Jesus said, "This is my body." And Mary? She is the mother of the church, the one who stood at the foot of the cross when everyone else ran, the one who never doubted, never wavered, never abandoned her son. She is the model of perfect faith. And in a time when faith is collapsing, when doubts are everywhere, when confusion reigns, Mary is the one who points you back to Jesus, not to herself, to Him. That's why Don Bosco saw 2 columns, not 1, because you need both. The Eucharist anchors you to Christ. Mary anchors you to faithfulness. Without the Eucharist, you drift into relativism. Without Mary, you drift into pride. But with both, you can survive any storm. The mathematical precision of convergence. Here's something that should make you pause. If these prophecies were random, if they were just pious imagination, you'd expect them to contradict each other. You'd expect vague timelines, conflicting details, incompatible messages. But that's not what you find. Instead, you find convergence. Fatima says, crisis of faith, targeting consecrated souls, devil's final battle. Don Bosco says, internal division, confusion, abandonment, survival only through Eucharist and Mary. Garabandal says, church in worst crisis, priests losing their way, moral collapse. Akita says, cardinals opposing cardinals, bishops against bishops, demon infiltrating the church. They're describing the same event from different angles. And the time frame? Fatima. We are in the last times, said in 1957. Don Bosco. Third age after the second millennium, meaning 2020, 2040. Garabandal. Before the warning, when communism returns and church appears divided beyond repair. Akita. When sins reach their peak, when the church is infiltrated, when priests are falling away. All of them pointing to one specific period. And we're in it. Right now. The call you can't ignore. So what do you do with this information? Do you panic? Do you despair? No, because every single one of these prophecies includes the same promise. Those who remain faithful will be protected. Not physically, necessarily, but spiritually. Those who cling to the Eucharist will not be swept away by confusion. Those who trust in Mary will not be led astray by false teachers. Those who pray the Rosary will have the clarity to see through the lies. This isn't about hiding in a bunker waiting for the world to end. It's about standing firm while everything around you shakes. It's about being the ones who don't abandon ship when everyone else is jumping overboard. It's about remembering that the church has survived worse, far worse. And it will survive this too, because Christ promised, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Not might not, shall not. But that doesn't mean it won't be painful. That doesn't mean it won't be terrifying. And that doesn't mean you can afford to be complacent. If this shook you, don't stop here, listen to me. If what you've just heard has made your heart race, if it's made you see your world differently, if it's made you realize that we're living in a moment every prophet warned about, then you cannot stop here. Subscribe to this channel right now, leave a like. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because we're not done. The most important part, the part that explains exactly what happens next and how you prepare for it, is still coming. And trust me, you need to hear it. There's a room in the Vatican archives that most people will never see. It's not the famous secret archives that tourists hear about. It's deeper, more restricted. A place where documents are kept not because they're ancient, but because they're dangerous. Not dangerous in the sense of heresy or falsehood, dangerous because of what they reveal about the Church's own future. And buried in those archives, in files marked with the names of mystics and saints, in journals and letters and testimonies gathered over centuries, is a pattern that Vatican officials have known about for decades but have been terrified to discuss publicly. Because if the faithful understood what these documents actually say, if they connected all the dots in one place, if they saw the full picture, everything would change. And now in 2025, we're at the moment when the pattern completes itself, when all the prophecies converge, when the warnings become reality, when the question is no longer, will this happen? But rather, what do we do now that it's here? The document that changed everything. Let me take you back to 1984. Pope John Paul II has just recovered from the assassination attempt 3 years earlier, the one predicted in the Third Secret of Fatima. He's convinced that Our Lady of Fatima saved his life. So he does something unprecedented. He orders a complete review of all approved Marian apparitions and mystic prophecies from the past 2 centuries. He wants to know, what are they saying? Is there a common thread? Is there a timeline? A team of cardinals and theologians is assembled. They spend months going through archives, reading testimonies, cross-referencing dates and predictions. And what they discover shakes them. Every major approved apparition is warning about the same period, a period of great crisis in the church, a period when faith would be tested like never before, a period when the faithful would feel abandoned, confused, scattered. But here's the part that terrified them. The timeline wasn't vague. When they mapped out all the references, the ones that mentioned generations, ages, centuries, they all pointed to the same window, roughly 2020 to 2040. The team presents their findings to John Paul II in a private audience. According to one cardinal who was present, and who spoke about it years later after John Paul's death, the Pope went silent for a long time. Finally, he asked, "What do we do with this?" And the team's recommendation was unanimous. We prepare, but we don't publicize. Why? Because publicizing it would cause panic. It would give ammunition to schismatics, to conspiracy theorists, to people who want to use prophecy as a weapon. But more than that, it would force the church to admit that the crisis was coming from inside, that the enemy wasn't just secularism or atheism or persecution. The enemy was confusion within the church itself. And how do you tell the faithful that their own shepherds might lead them astray? How do you tell them that some bishops will contradict the Pope, that some priests will lose faith, that some theologians will teach heresy? You can't. Not without causing the very division you're trying to prevent. So they made a choice. They would prepare the church quietly. They would emphasize the Eucharist, devotion to Mary, the Rosary, traditional practices. But they wouldn't explain why. And for 40 years, that's exactly what they did. Until now. Because in 2025, you don't need secret documents to see what's happening. You just need to open your eyes. Don Bosco's final vision, what he saw about the papacy. Now let's go back to Don Bosco, because there's one vision he had that almost no one talks about. It's recorded in the private journals of Father Michael Rua, dated January 1888, just weeks before Don Bosco's death. Don Bosco was so weak by this point that he could barely speak. But one morning he woke up agitated, almost frantic. He called Rua to his bedside and said he needed to tell him something immediately, before he forgot. And this is what he said. "I saw the Holy Father, but there were 2 figures, both dressed in white. One was clear and strong, leading the church toward the columns. The other was shadowy, confusing, pulling in a different direction. And the faithful did not know which one to follow." Rua was confused. "2 popes?" he asked. Don Bosco shook his head weakly. "Not 2 popes, 2 paths. 2 voices claiming to speak for the church. And the faithful torn between them, not knowing which is true." Rua pressed him. "When will this happen?" Don Bosco closed his eyes. "When the church seems most secure, that is when the test will come. When the world thinks the storm has passed, that is when the real battle begins. Look for it when the Eucharist is most ignored, when Mary is most forgotten. That is the sign." Rua recorded this conversation but marked it not for publication. Why? Because suggesting that the faithful might someday be confused about the Pope himself, about who speaks for the true church and who doesn't, that's dynamite. That's the kind of statement that could tear the church apart if misunderstood or weaponized. But in 2025, can you honestly say it sounds crazy? When you have bishops openly contradicting the Pope, when you have cardinals writing letters questioning his teachings, when you have entire movements within the church claiming the Pope is leading people astray, when you have traditional Catholics and progressive Catholics both claiming to be the real church, that's not hypothetical anymore, that's reality. And it's exactly what Don Bosco saw, the real meaning of the 2 columns. Now we need to talk about what the 2 columns actually represent, because most people think it's just a nice symbol, the Eucharist and Mary, the 2 pillars of Catholic faith. True, But it's more than that. Think about what a column does. It doesn't just stand there looking pretty, it holds something up. And in Don Bosco's vision, those two columns weren't decorative. They were anchors. The only safe place in the entire ocean. The only thing that didn't move while everything else was chaos. Now think about what that means practically. The Eucharist is objective truth. It's not up for debate. It's not influenced by culture or politics or popular opinion. Christ is either present in the Blessed Sacrament, or Catholicism is a lie. There's no middle ground. So when the church is being pulled in 1,000 different directions, when every theologian has a different opinion, when bishops contradict each other, when you don't know who to trust, the Eucharist doesn't change. It's the same Jesus who walked the earth 2,000 years ago. It's the same sacrifice offered on Calvary. It's the same presence that saints and martyrs have worshipped for 20 centuries. That's your anchor. And Mary? She's not just a symbol of devotion. She's the model of perfect obedience. When the angel told her God's plan, she didn't negotiate. She didn't demand clarification. She didn't ask for a committee to study it. She said, "Let it be done to me according to your word." That's faith. Not blind faith, not stupid faith, but trusting faith. Even when you don't understand, even when it's terrifying, even when everyone around you thinks you're crazy. And in a time when everything is being questioned, when nothing feels certain, when even the church seems confused, Mary shows you what faithfulness looks like. Not clinging to your own understanding, but clinging to God's promise. So the two columns aren't just symbols, they're instructions. When the storm comes, and the storm is already here, you anchor yourself to the Eucharist and to Mary. Everything else can shake. Those two things will not. Why 2025? Why now? All right, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Why is this all happening now? Why is 2025 significant? Because if you map out the timeline of everything we've discussed, a pattern emerges. 1917, Fatima. The warnings begin. Sister Lucia says, "We are already in the last times." 1962, Don Bosco's dream of the two columns is republished widely, just as Vatican II begins, a council that will reshape the church and inadvertently unleash decades of confusion. 1973, Akita. The Virgin Mary warns of cardinals opposing cardinals, bishops against bishops. This is 52 years ago. In biblical numerology, 52 is significant. It's 40 years of trial plus 12 years of completion. 2020, COVID-19, churches closed, the faithful separated from the Eucharist. Mass attendance collapses and never fully recovers. Exactly as Don Bosco's private visions described. A plague of fear, not of body, that separates the faithful from the sacraments. 2025. We are now 5 years into the window Don Bosco described, 3 or 4 generations after 2000, meaning the 2020s, 2030s. We're at the midpoint between 2020 and 2030. And what's happening? Everything the mystics predicted. The church is more divided than at any point since the Protestant Reformation. Priests are leaving or losing faith in record numbers. The Eucharist is ignored even by Catholics. Bishops publicly contradict each other. The faithful are confused, scattered, angry. And the world? Wars. Rumors of wars. Moral collapse. Truth itself being questioned. This isn't coincidence, this is the convergence, all the threads coming together at once. The part they didn't want you to know. Here's the secret the Vatican has been sitting on. This crisis was always meant to be a purification, not a punishment, not the end. A purification. Think about it. When the church gets too comfortable, when it becomes too worldly, when it compromises too much with culture, when it loses its edge, God allows a shaking, not to destroy the church, and He promised that's impossible, but to shake off everything that doesn't belong. The lukewarm Catholics, who were only there for cultural reasons, they leave. The priests who never really had vocations, they leave. The theologians who wanted to be popular instead of faithful, they expose themselves. The bishops who cared more about politics than truth, they reveal their true colors. It's painful. It's terrifying, but it's necessary. Because what's left after the shaking? The ones who really believe. The ones who stay not because it's easy, but because they can't leave. The ones who kneel before the Eucharist because they know it's Jesus. The ones who pray the rosary because they trust Mary. The ones who endure the storm because they're anchored. That's the church that survives. Not the biggest, not the most popular, but the most faithful. And that's what Don Bosco saw in the end of his vision. After the battle, after the chaos, after the storm. A smaller church, but a radiant church. Anchored, unshakable, pure. What this means for you. Right now. So let's bring this home. You're living in the time every prophet warned about. You're living in the moment when the church is being tested like never before. You're living in the exact window Don Bosco saw in his private visions. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to panic? Are you going to despair? Are you going to leave the church because it's messy, because it's confusing, because the shepherds seem lost? Or are you going to anchor yourself? Are you going to go to Mass, even when you're the only one under 50 in the pews? Are you going to kneel before the Eucharist, even when your friends think it's weird? Are you going to pray the rosary, even when it feels like it's not doing anything? Because here's the promise, if you anchor yourself, you will not be swept away. Not because you're strong, but because the anchor is strong. Christ in the Eucharist doesn't fail. Mary's intercession doesn't fail. They held firm for 2,000 years. They'll hold firm now. But you have to choose to anchor yourself to them. No one can do it for you. Not your bishop, not your priest, not your parents, not your friends. You. The hope. Hidden in the prophecy. Now here's the part that should give you hope. Every single one of these prophecies, Fatima, Akita, Garabandal, Don Bosco, they all include the same ending. After the trial, triumph. After the purification, renewal. After the storm, peace. Not because we earned it, but because God promised it. Our Lady of Fatima said, "In the end, my immaculate heart will triumph." Not might triumph. Will triumph. Don Bosco saw the ship anchored safely between the two columns, the enemy fleet destroyed, the storm calmed. Sister Lucia of Fatima said there would be a period of peace given to the world after the consecration of Russia and the fulfillment of heaven's requests. Akita promised that after the fire falls, a remnant will remain. Those who prayed, those who trusted, those who stayed faithful. So yes, we're in the storm. Yes, it's terrifying. Yes, it feels like everything is falling apart. But that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is victory. The question is, will you be part of the remnant that sees it? Why Don Bosco matters more than ever. Let me bring this full circle. Why does Don Bosco's prophecy matter so much right now? Because unlike some mystical visions that are beautiful but vague, Don Bosco gave us instructions. He didn't just say, "Be holy." He didn't just say, "Pray more." He showed us exactly where to anchor, the Eucharist and Mary. Not 1,000 devotions, not a complicated system, not secret knowledge. 2 anchors. And both are accessible to every Catholic, right now, today. You don't need special permission to go to adoration. You don't need a theology degree to pray the rosary. You don't need to be a mystic to receive Jesus in the Eucharist. Anyone can do this. The street kid in Don Bosco's oratory could do it. The simple peasant children at Fatima could do it. The poor nun in Japan could do it, and you can do it. That's the genius of God's plan. When everything else becomes complicated, confusing, inaccessible, the path to salvation remains simple. Go to Mass, receive the Eucharist, pray the rosary, trust Mary. That's it. That's how you survive the storm. So here's what I want you to do. If this video has shaken you, if it's made you see the world differently, if it's made you realize that we're living in a moment of supernatural significance, then don't just watch and walk away. Do something. Go to Mass this week. Even if you haven't been in months, even if you haven't been in years. Spend 10 minutes in front of the Blessed Sacrament. Just sit there. Just be with Jesus. Pray 1 rosary. Just 1. Even if you don't know all the mysteries, even if you stumble through the prayers, Anchor yourself. Because the storm isn't over. In fact, according to every prophecy we've looked at, it's just beginning. The years between now and 2030 are going to be unlike anything the modern church has experienced. More confusion, more division, more falling away, but also more grace, more miracles, more conversions. Because that's how God works. When the darkness is deepest, the light shines brightest. And those who stay anchored, those who refuse to abandon ship, they become the light, not because they're perfect, but because they refuse to let go. Don Bosco died on January 31st, 1888. His last words were to his Salesian brothers gathered around his bed. He could barely speak, but with his final breath, he whispered, "Remember the columns. Whatever happens, remember the columns." And then he was gone. For 137 years, those words echoed through the Salesian order. Remember the columns. But most of the world forgot. Until now. Because now, in 2025, as we watch the church shake, as we watch the faithful scatter, as we watch the storm Don Bosco predicted become our daily reality, those words aren't just history, they're survival instructions. Remember the columns, the Eucharist, Mary. Anchor yourself there, and you will not be swept away. I promise you. Not because I'm anyone special, but because every saint and mystic who saw this moment gave you the same promise. Anchor yourself to Christ in the Eucharist. Anchor yourself to faithfulness through Mary. And when the storm passes, and it will pass, you'll still be standing. Not because you were strong, but because the anchor held. If this story moved your heart, if it reminded you that even in darkness there is light, subscribe to this channel right now, leave a like, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because maybe, just maybe, someone close to you is drowning in confusion right now. Maybe they've lost hope. Maybe they think the church is finished. And maybe this message, this reminder that God has been preparing his people for this exact moment for over a century, maybe that's exactly what they need to hold on. Remember the columns, and may God bless you in the storm.